I'd like to thank Senator Kelleher for facilitating the commencement of our meeting today. I remind members to please switch off their mobile phones as they interfere with the recording equipment. Apologies have been received from Deputy Peter Fitzpatrick and Senators Frances Black and Niall Ó Donnghaile. The purpose of this morning's meeting is to discuss the issue of regulation and control of the gambling sector. We shall first meet with the Minister of State at the Department of Justice and Equality, Deputy David Stanton, for an update in relation to the Government's legislative plans in this area. Before then, meeting with Professor Crystal Fulton of University College Dublin. I want to welcome the Minister of State and his officials here this morning, and I will shortly invite you, Minister, to make your opening statement. However, I must remind members and the Minister that they should be aware that under the salient rulings of the Chair, members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official by name in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I also remind members to bear in mind that the Minister of State must leave us at 9:45 and to therefore keep their contributions short. We will, following the Minister's departure, then continue our engagement with Professor Fulton taking the chair at that time. So I now invite Minister of State Stanton to make his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'm very happy to have the opportunity this morning to inform the Joint Committee of the Government's efforts and intentions in relation to regulation and control of the gambling sector. And apologies for having to leave at that time, but I would be quite happy to come back at any time, Chairman, to engage with the committee and to hear the views of the committee on this very important issue. Gambling activities of considerable economic importance in Ireland. In 2017, the returns from the 1% betting duty and sales of national lottery ticket sales alone suggested an industry with a turnover in the order of $6 billion annually, and it might be more than that. There are no figures published for revenue from online gaming, gaming in arcades and private members' clubs, bingo, including online, or for the thousands of local community lotteries and raffles in the state. It would not be unreasonable, Chairman, to estimate the turnover of the Irish gambling market annually as being between €6 billion and €8 billion. As members of the committee will be aware, the government efforts to bring about reform was signalled by the publication in 2013 of the general scheme of the Gambling Control Bill. That scheme was examined by the Justice Committee at the time, but unfortunately did not progress. Since assuming responsibility for this area in 2016, I was determined to review the provisions of the 2013 general scheme to take account of the complex and ever-evolving nature of the gambling environment, both domestic and international. Increasingly, gambling is an activity that is moving to an online environment, and traditional gaming arcades and other places are diminishing in importance. As the gambling industry changes so much, the state's licensing and regulatory approach, the development of modern fit-for-purpose legislation is necessary and a priority for the government. A modern regulatory approach will enhance consumer protection in all forms of gambling, increase the protection of vulnerable persons and potentially increase exchequer revenue from the gambling industry. Incremental change is not a viable approach to this reform. Effective reform will require fundamental and significant change. This will take some time to develop, and it is essential that significant resources are committed to support the reform. The Interdepartmental Working Group on the future licensing and regulation of gambling was established in January 2018 to review the provisions of the General Scheme of the Gambling Control Bill 2013 to determine if they remain fit for purpose in the light of the significant developments in the gambling industry, both domestic and international, in the intervening period. The Government approved the Working Group's report and published it on the 20th of March last. I hope that members of the committee have had a chance to examine it since, and as you can see, there's a lot in it. It's quite detailed. Critically, the report recommended that all future responsibility for licensing and regulation of all forms of gambling be vested in the proposed new Gambling Regulatory Authority. In summary, the Working Group also proposed the rationalisation of the lengthy list of licensing categories for gambling activities recommended in the 2013 scheme, given the increasing move to online gambling, that significant background checking be required in determining applications for gambling licences, that all gambling licences should have appropriate terms and conditions attached to protect consumers and vulnerable persons and for assisting in combating fraud and money laundering, a range of possible options on the future approach to regulating advertising, sponsorship and promotion of gambling products, taking into account impacts for related sectors, and an improvement in the current minimal protection for consumers of gambling products to ensure fairness for all parties involved. An alternative disputes resolution mechanism should be developed to settle disputes. The Working Group is conscious of the issue of problem gambling in Irish society, which can involve severely negative impacts for the person involved as well as his or her family. It considered that The approach taken in the 2013 General Scheme towards the protection of vulnerable persons remained broadly valid. This included the establishment of a social fund funded by levies on licensed gambling operators to assist with research and information campaigns and to support dedicated gambling addiction treatment by those professional expert organisations involved in the field. Since I have some responsibility in this area, my guiding principle has been that we must licence and regulate in a modern, transparent and proportionate manner the many legitimate gambling pursuits in which many citizens choose to participate. In doing so, we must ensure the best possible enforcement of the law and compliance with licensing conditions, increase revenue to the Exchequer, improve services to consumers and support the optimal protection for persons who may be vulnerable to addiction. Chairman, the main element of the Government decision on reform of March 2019 was approving the establishment of a new gambling regulatory authority as an independent statutory body. The Government is clearly of the view, and I hope that is one that can be shared by the Committee, that without the establishment of a new gambling regulatory authority, modern effective licensing and regulation could not be achieved. Independent regulation would mirror the situation in most EU member states. Our current legislation does not provide for a coherent licensing and regulatory approach to gambling activities. Responsibility for licensing is shared among a number of departments and agencies. This fragmentation does not facilitate a consistent and effective approach to ensuring consumer protection and the protection of vulnerable persons, including of underage persons. Committee members will appreciate that effective modern licensing and regulation will require significant additional resources, primarily for the operation of the new regulatory authority. The working group agreed, however, that any new regulatory authority should, to a large degree, be ultimately self-financing, with income from licence fees, fines imposed on operators and other duties. The group also examined the issue of advertising, sponsorship and promotion of gambling products and looked at a range of possible options on the future approach to these activities. These matters have attracted much public interest and comment. Suggestions of potential restrictions in this regard must be carefully considered, targeted and be effective, of course. Sectors of Irish sporting activity depend heavily on gambling advertising and sponsorship and would risk being very negatively impacted by severe restrictions. Chairman, the committee wished to be informed as to the Gaming and Lotteries Amendment Bill 2019. I am pleased to report that last evening in the Senate we launched the second stage debate in this bill, which amends the Gaming and Lotteries Act 2016, and the second stage actually completed in the Senate last evening as well. That bill contains the existing provisions governing the permit and licence approach to gaming and lottery activity. The bill provides for the modernisation of the Gaming and Lotteries Act 1956 by way of, among other matters, bringing clarity to the permit and licensing approach to small-scale local gaming and lottery activity, updating certain stake and prize limits and standardising the minimum age for engaging in gambling at 18. The bill further provides for an amendment to the Totaliser Act 1929 to introduce a minimum age of 18 years for betting with the tote. I must emphasise that this bill is very much an interim reform measure pending development of a comprehensive reform of the licensing and regulation of all gambling activities. The amendments to the 56 Act will help to promote the promoters of local gaming and lottery activity, primarily sporting clubs and community organisations, by bringing greater coherence and clarity to the application process for permits and licences. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Minister of State. So we're going to open it up to members. The first who had indicated was Deputy Jack Chambers, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thank the Minister for coming in and updating us. I suppose I know you're genuine in your attention to regulate gambling, and obviously as previous Chair of the committee, you provided some oversight of the past bill. I suppose I'm somewhat disappointed that 3 years on from your tenure in the Department of Justice, we've had no action, no legislation and no progress. And I was surprised that before Christmas or around Christmas that you announced your intention to establish a regulatory authority, not this year, but sometime next year. And unfortunately, this Dáil will fail gambling addicts when it comes to regulation, because we won't have advanced legislation that was first published in 2013. Whilst I recognise that technology has advanced to an extent, people had apps on their phones in 2013, and technology was a serious matter in 2013. It's not like we had a new invention in the last 5 years. And I think there should have been progress on that. To think that we've waited 6 years to say you're now going to establish a regulatory authority isn't good enough. And I think it's failed the people who are really vulnerable in this space. So I just think that we have to put that on the record. We as a party sought to reintroduce the general scheme that had been previously published to facilitate and help your department to progress this issue. But we've had more reviews and reports. But the metric now is delivery. And whilst I acknowledge your own intentions, your department hasn't been active enough in this legislative space. but you're the responsible and accountable one on that. I just want to ask about the, what engagement have you had with the Department of Health around a national, around having a health, around addressing the issues of gambling addiction, and what funding does the government provide for people with gambling addiction, and what engagement have you had with the Department of Health on that?
Minister, please.
Thanks very much. One question. The engagement with the issue of problem gambling and gambling addiction, and the Deputy is right, Chairman, is primarily a health issue. And even in jurisdictions where they have very strong regulation, they still have problem gambling and addiction. So I have to kind of say that establishing a regulator will help and assist and bring fairness as far as we can to the industry and to the activities involved. If someone has a gambling addiction, it's primarily a health matter, and that person needs treatment. And I have met people who have had gambling addiction issues, who have had treatment, and like any addiction, sometimes can actually relapse back into the problem again. So the issue of addiction is primarily a health matter. What we propose to do in the authority is to establish a social fund to help fund that. But these matters are primarily a matter for the Deputy, my colleague Minister Byrne, who's responsible. I'm working on the issue of regulation. I know, but I have to caution that we have two studies on. One study has been published, which looked at gambling, the prevalence of gambling in Ireland, in the whole island, from 2014 to 2015, and there's another ongoing at the moment, 2018, 2019. Our department are part funding that as well. So that's the engagement. But I have to be careful in that the issue of addiction and health is a matter for health.
With respect, Minister,
not for me. We can make it fair. We can make it fair. And we can do the best we can to do that and to look at things like glamorising and advertising and all that space. But if someone has a health issue, it's a matter for the Department of Health.
That's like the Minister for Justice telling us that he's no responsibility for the healthcare of his prisoners within the prison system. I mean, that's just a nonsense argument. You're operating within a government system where there should be cooperation around all the issues. You're responsible for regulating gambling, for licensing of gambling. And whilst we've had no legislative activity in this space, I have raised the issue with the Department of Health and with Minister Byrne, and there's been absolutely zero progress on policy terms when it comes to people with gambling addiction and around the funding in that space. And I don't think it's good enough to silo your department away from having a responsibility there, because the lack of regulation and the lack of a social fund is one of the reasons we don't have funding for addiction. But I think there should be impetus on your behalf to ensure that Minister Byrne does take this seriously, that she does fund addiction services, because at the moment it's like a lot of other things in healthcare. It's a two-tier approach where if you have money personally, you can access private addiction services. But if you need the state support, you're left vulnerable because of the gambling companies and their targeting of people, but you have no ability to get the treatment. So I think, whilst there's a delay with the legislation, I think there's no excuse around having government funding for people with problem gambling and with addiction in that, and it's not good enough that we have departments operating in different silos. You have a collective responsibility there. I want to ask specifically about the open and illegal gaming that's going on within Dublin City and other places. Are you concerned that Part 3 of the 1956 Gaming and Lotteries Act has been blatantly and illegally flouted, that we've total and open illegal operations where our own statutory authorities are turning a blind eye in this city and in other places, and do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chairman. Yes, obviously anything that's illegal would cause concern, but and again, at the risk of being criticised again by Deputy Chambers, I just want to point out that currently we're not responsible for any And this is the truth. And a lot of people don't actually get this or appreciate this. For any licensing or regulation of gambling, the Department of Justice isn't. The revised legislation will deal with issues of self-exclusion, by the way, which is coming forward. So it's not our area of responsibility. As
Minister, are you aware of the
blatant
breaches of the law within our city, where we have gaming machines which have no licence, and where Part 3 of the 1956 Act hasn't been commenced? That has an issue for revenue, it has an issue for our court system, and an issue for An Garda Síochána. And what is being done at a government level to make sure our statutory authorities uphold the law? You do have a responsibility there, because you have lines of communication with each of those statutory bodies.
Well, legally, we don't have responsibility for that. That is the fact. That is a fact, and I've checked it out. We don't have responsibility for that legally.
Are you concerned that we have blatant breaches of the law around gaming operations?
Again, I can't comment on anything that's. I can't comment on an allegation like that. I just can't do that.
So, no, I beg your pardon.
I think this is, Minister, I think this is...
Deputy Chambers, I'm sorry. I want to just remind you again of the appeal I made at the start. We only have the Minister until 9:45. I have 4 other colleagues who wish to also ask. I don't want to interrupt your line of questioning.
Yeah. I'm going to pass my colleagues out because they may have similar questions. But all I'd say is I get a sense that, you know, we've ministers comment on lots of things, and we know there's been a lot of investigative journalism where they've identified illegal operations blatantly within our city and in other places, which has significant implications for revenue for the state, where we've licences being breached from the district court, and we've a blind eye approach being taken. We had some token sampling that revenue engaged in recent times, but the fact that you feel you can't comment, I think, demonstrates a kind of a worrying shadow of the power of this industry. We have ministers commenting on lots of issues all of the time. It's a bit like saying the Minister for Sport doesn't have responsibility for the FAI because it's a charity. He was happy to comment yesterday when it's in the public spotlight. This is an issue with a blatant breach of the law, and you're refusing to comment. I think that shows a very worrying, Chairperson, a very worrying shadow of a powerful industry that doesn't want to be regulated and doesn't want the spotlight. It's unfortunate we've only 45 minutes to discuss this.
Okay, Deputy Chambers, I appreciate your remarks. Deputy Clare Daly, please.
In fairness to Jack, he's led a lot on this issue, and I think it is regrettable that the Minister is only here for a short time. I mean, already, based on Jack's intervention, I'm even more worried about this than I was before, to be honest, because the Minister seems to be hiding behind interdepartmental responsibilities and is failing to answer what everybody knows is a fact about blatant illegality in this area. And I suppose our concern would come from the fact that you've been just floating around a general scheme like since 2013. The working group was set up, it's come out, and now we have this sort of technical bill that's really, I suppose, in some ways wasted the time of the drafters and your department, when the real gambling control bill that's necessary is nowhere to be seen. And I'm wondering, could you give us a bit more detail on that? Why is it because of lobbying and pushback from the industry? What is causing this delay? Because any answers you've given so far doesn't really answer the issue to me.
Minister, please.
On the issue of lobbying, any lobbying that has come to my attention from industry has been asking for a regulator. And I've had nobody saying to me they don't want a regulator. And as far as I know, the department haven't either. So I just want to there is an agreed acceptance out there that we need a regulator, and I'm very anxious, Deputy Daly, to have a regulator as well. I really am. And it's proven to be far, far more difficult and technical than I envisaged. I'd love to have a regulator tomorrow, but it's just and if you go through the interdepartmental working group, you can just see how complex it is. But we have spent the last year really working very hard in analysing every aspect of this, and I'm sure you've read the report. It's very detailed, it's very complex, but the report is there now, and I'd be very anxious at some stage, Chairman. I'm willing to come back here at any time to the committee. And I apologise, Deputy, before you came in for the fact that I can't be here for longer than 45 minutes this morning. But I am anxious and interested in the views of the constructive views of the committee and the help the committee can give us in bringing this work forward. We are where we are at the moment, and I take the criticism that it's taken a long time, and I really wish it hadn't taken this amount of time, but it has. We have the report. It took a year to put together. There was a lot of work involved in it, a lot of interaction, a lot of research, and we also have the Gaming and Lotteries Amendment Bill, which isn't just a technical bill. It does a lot more than it might seem initially, and it will help in many ways to regulate some of the stuff that's going on out there. But so on the issue of lobbying, personally, no, it hasn't. We haven't come under any pressure. People actually want this, and I want it as well.
Yeah,
we'll have to leave the time restrictions apply also to you, Minister.
Sorry,
to the
apologies.
well, just very briefly then, I mean, I suppose the thing is, I would see it more as this bill as an attempt to be seen to be doing something rather than actually grappling with the bigger issue. But in any case, can we deal with and your briefing notes and all that have pitched it as a minor and technical thing, and now you're saying, oh no, it isn't, it's a lot more than that. So there's actually a contradiction in the written material supporting this and what you're saying now. I want to ask about the issue of the I suppose the points been raised by the private members' clubs that this is just an effort to shut them down. I'm wondering, is that your intention? I don't have a particular horse in this game or anything, I'm just saying, is that your intention, or is it an unanticipated side effect of the bill? And that's because they say the bill provides them all, that to have to get a gaming permit whose conditions are so stringent that the clubs will be basically put out of operation. And I suppose their point that they would make is that it'll drive people who currently go to private members' clubs underground. And while online betting is licensed, online gaming isn't. It's a lot more dangerous, they would say, whereas in clubs they can put restrictions on. Is it your intention to shut them down, or what's the story there?
No, what we want to do is what we're doing actually is updating the 1956 Act. And as I said initially, this brings clarity to the whole area of local lotteries and sports. It's local lotteries that a lot of sporting clubs and community organisations partake in. It makes it a lot clearer than that. And in 1956, there was a lot of emphasis on circuses and carnivals and all that area, which has totally changed. So this particular bill focuses more on what's happening right now at the moment. It also updates the stakes and prizes to bring it up to date, which was also looked for.
Okay. Jerry, if you could.
Well, just the last point. I mean, if you could deal with the specific point that those organisations made, which is the clause that they claim will shut them down, where it says a gaming permit shall not be issued to a person for any kind of gaming in which, by reason of the nature of the game, the chances of all players, including the banker, are not equal. Obviously, that deals with all of, there's none of the games that operate in these clubs that don't come under that remit, and that therefore, since they're a feature of the game themselves, we're effectively in this legislation shutting them down while allowing free rein online with a lot more or a lot less checks. So in terms of that clause, and I'll leave it at that for this bit.
Well, as I said, it passed second stage in the Dáil last night. We're not changing the law. That provision that the Deputy has mentioned is already in the 56 Act as it is, so it's already there in law. And when it comes into the committee, these private members' clubs are not licensed under the 56 Act in any event. So we will get an opportunity here shortly after Christmas or after Easter, to come to the committee hopefully with that piece of legislation. We can tease out even further. It is before the Shannon at the moment, and I just want to be cautious that I don't preempt the debate there.
Okay, Deputy Daly, thank you. Deputy Mick Wallace, please.
And maybe we should have let Jack keep talking and ask questions, because he knows more about it than the rest of us, and fair play to him for the work he's done on it. Minister, in one of your replies to Jack, you said that legally you're not responsible for the flagrant ignoring of the law on places like Westmoreland Street and O'Connell Street. I don't really understand that. I mean, these places that have completely ignored the fact that this is illegal under the 56 Act, and the Garda have turned a blind eye for years. I mean, I would have understood that the Garda fall under your remit. I understand Revenue don't. But Revenue are actually doing probably more about it now than, obviously, the Guards seem to have turned a blind eye to it. I mean, the Licensed Gaming Association of Ireland, which represents the licensed operators, including those in Courtown in my own area, estimate the loss of the exchequer to be in tens of millions every year. I mean, I don't know why. Can you explain to me why this doesn't really register with you as much? I asked Minister Flanagan about the enforcement role of the Gardaí in relation to unlicensed gaming activities and the availability of gaming machines in locations in which gaming is prohibited. That was February last year, I asked him. And Minister Flanagan told me he would request a report from Garda authorities on the matter. The report was never produced. I asked him twice again about this promised report. In response to my last parliamentary question on the matter, in January this year, the Minister completely ignored the initial promise of a report in relation to the Gardaí's role. I presume I'm never going to see the report now. I also find it mad that the Minister for Justice would need to ask the Gardaí for a report on their enforcement role when this role and the Garda's powers are fairly obvious from the 56 Act. I mean, can you explain why the Gardaí have ignored or haven't acted in relation to their enforcement role in terms of seizing game machines which are prohibited under Part 3 of the 56 Act? And can you clarify how he can be sure the Gardaí will actually act in terms of enforcing the provisions of this particular amendment in the future?
Thanks for the question, Deputy. Two things arise here. First of all, I can't comment as to whether or not something is illegal. I mean, and to do so could actually prejudice anything that might take place afterwards, as we've seen in the past. I can't actually say here that something is illegal. I'm not a judge, and again, with respect, neither are any of us here. So that's first. The second thing is, neither the Minister nor I direct the Gardaí what to do, and they're under the operation of the Commissioner. So the Gardaí make
under a year of restriction.
No, it doesn't work like that. The politicians can't tell the Guards what to do. We can't actually, I'm sure the Deputy understands this, we can't direct the Guards to do X, Y or Z. We can't do that. The Commissioner makes those decisions himself. And then finally, the same with the Revenue Commissioners. They're independent as well, as they should be. If I come in here and I said to the Deputy that I directed the Garda Commissioner to do X, Y or Z, I'm sure the Deputy would be the first man jumping over the fence there saying you can't do that. The Guards should be independent. So this is where it is. But I'm sure that the Deputy's comments are being noted this morning. And this is why this hearing is useful.
Are you telling me, Minister, that the Garda Síochána are independent of politics in Ireland? Because I don't believe that.
No, what I'm saying is that, well, the Deputy can believe whatever he wishes himself. I'm sure he does believe what he says. But I can say that I cannot and do not and will not instruct the Garda to take any particular action in any particular area. They're independent.
Oh, God bless us.
As they should be.
Can you explain, Minister, sorry, I didn't, I know Clare brought it up there, about the fact that these private members' clubs are literally going to be kind of run out of business now in between this amendment and an eventual proper bill. I mean, is that not a concern? I mean, I think there's over 2,000 people working for these places. What's going to happen to them?
Well, the private members' clubs are not licensed under the 56 Act in any event, I understand. And also the provision that the Deputy is discussing is already in the 56 Act as it is. So on the one hand, the Deputy is saying that the law shouldn't be enforced, on the other hand, he's saying it should.
No, listen, I'm all enforcing the law, but I mean, what I have a problem with is the manner you're going about this, right? And I don't understand how, you know, in order to get, well, first of all, I mean, we should be, as Jack has been saying, the gambling control bill should have been introduced long before now, and we probably wouldn't have this problem. But because you've been lax in your approach to this whole area, somebody is going to lose out. Is that not a fact?
Well, the Gaming and Lotteries Amendment Bill was in the Shannon last evening. The Gambling Control Bill will provide for licensed casinos, 5 members clubs will be able to apply for casino licences under that. And can I say that we have a bill before the Shannon at the moment. Again, I don't want to preempt any debate that might occur there. It will come in here later on. No change will occur in the current situation until that bill is passed and enacted. And the deputies will have an opportunity here, and I would welcome their views and amendments at that time when it comes here. So it's in the mix. We have actually published it, and as I said, it has passed through second stage in the Shannon last evening.
Will the government actively promote the bill brought forward by Jack and Jim?
We have our own proposals based on the report to government that was approved last March to set up a totally independent statutory authority with a lot more power and responsibility than in the 2013 proposal, which we also debated here at that time when I was in the chair here. But since then, we've looked at it again, and as I said at the very beginning, Deputy, we've looked at what's gone on in almost all other EU countries, and they have an independent statutory authority with the teeth and the power and the resources to really get to grips with this. And we're of the view that an office in the Department of Justice wouldn't just do the business. And so this is why we've changed it completely, and that's why it has taken this while to get to where we are. But we have the report published now, and the next thing now is to bring forward heads of bill, which we'll send here for your comments at that time. And I'm very anxious, as I said earlier, to move on this as quickly as I can. Very anxious. And I'm frustrated. I am frustrated it has taken this long.
Am I wrong in thinking that if speed was a priority, that we'd actually be progressing Jack and Jim's bill long before now?
The bill that Fianna Fáil brought forward, the debate was very useful in the Dáil at the time, and I welcomed it, and we didn't oppose it because, strictly speaking, it does talk about setting up an office, if you will, to regulate this. Now, we've gone way beyond that in a regulatory authority, which is a totally different kettle of fish. And I do regret that it has taken this amount of time. Personally, I would have liked to have this done an awful lot faster than this, but it does take time, and it is frustrating, but that's where we are.
Wallace, I need to accommodate the other colleagues, please.
Yeah, my last point. In February this year, Minister, I asked a parliamentary question about the amount of funding allocated to gambling addiction services in each of the years from 2015 to 2018. Strangely, I was told by the HSC that the apportionment of funding dedicated solely to gambling addiction cannot be extracted from overall funding, which I don't really understand. I'm wondering, Minister, have you ever sought this information from the Department of Health or HSE? Surely the amount we spend on gambling addiction services would be useful to inform your department's government policy.
Well, we did take part in, and we funded the prevalence study, and there's another ongoing at the moment which we hope to be able in a position to produce at the end of this year. And again, as I said earlier on, and the situation with respect to addiction and all that side is a health matter, and is the remit of Deputy Byrne. And we work closely together on these issues, but that's her remit, and I just want to, I don't want to interfere in her role.
Would you disagree with my comment that the lack of joined-up thinking in this place beggars belief, and that it costs the state a lot of money?
Yeah, I did say at the start of my remarks, Chairman, that the regulation of this area is very fragmented, and that's why a regulatory authority will actually bring the regulation together under one body, if you like, under one umbrella. But again, I must stress that even where they have strong regulators, they still have issues of problem gambling and addiction, and that's a health matter. And the expertise resides there. We can actually work to make it fairer for people who get involved in the gambling activity. But if it's a health matter, then it's the remit of the Department of Health and HSE.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Deputy Wallace. Deputy Donnacha O'Leary. And can I just indicate to Deputy O'Leary, Deputy Jim O'Callaghan is next, and Senator Martin Conway. You've just a little over 3 minutes each. That includes the Minister's responses.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I suppose I'll be as quick as I can, I suppose, and just look, I mean, to echo the frustrations expressed by other members. I think there has been a lack of action here. This is something that, look, I mean, even from what the Minister says, there's a consensus of the need for regulation, and yet we're still in the same space as we were several years ago in relation to the lack of a regulator. This is a huge issue, affects a huge amount of people. I know there is a lack of data that's been touched on, but Irish Institute of Public Health say that 1% of the population affected by problem gambling, or 40,000 people. I suppose just briefly in terms of my questions, I suppose if the Minister can group them together, and if he can respond, I suppose is the Minister determined to ensure that fixed odds betting terminals don't make an impact in this jurisdiction and don't, I suppose, develop any routes, that is not tolerated? I suppose to ask a question in relation to the Minister's attitude in relation to the separation of gambling and alcohol, to ensure that, in as much as possible, that the two things are separately regulated and don't take place on the same premises. Just to ask as well, I suppose I would be, I suppose there's been reference made already to the strength of the lobby in relation to gambling, and I think a lot of the big gambling firms would make a lot of play of their own efforts in terms of tackling gambling. I would have my doubts, I have to say. You come across examples of, online in particular, the ability of some of the big firms to ban somebody for 4 or 5 profitable bets, that they can spot a pattern in terms of a profitable gambler, for want of a better word, and yet they seem to have great difficulty in identifying somebody who has a clear problem and is a problem gambler. I have to say I have my doubts about, they have an awful lot of information, they have an awful lot of data at their hands. Are they using it to the best of their abilities to identify people who are gambling too much, who have developed problematic habits? And I have to say, I think that they could do a great deal more. I leave it at that. I might have, I suppose, more questions for later speakers, but I think it's unfortunate. I suppose another minister is restricted, and this place is restricted in terms of its time, but a more substantial debate would have been, I suppose, more time, and in future, hopefully, we will have more opportunity.
Thank you, Deputy O'Leary.
Chairman,
Minister.
again, as I said at the start, I would be quite happy to come back at any stage for a more substantial debate on this issue. Any constructive comments or suggestions are most welcome in this very complicated area. Definitely, the Deputy said that talking about banning profitable bets in information data, it is envisaged again that banning profitable gambling, that the revised bill will include conditions on licence and consumer protection to take that into account. But the Deputy did point out that the industry has an awful lot of information and data and so forth, and he's right. And that's developing by the day and getting more and more complicated by the day. The separation of gambling and alcohol will be considered in the revised gambling control bill, certainly. That's in there, or will be in there. Fixed odd betting terminals will not be allowed. This is a stated government position that we don't want those.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Jim O'Callahan, please.
Yeah, I know, Minister, this is an issue to which you are personally committed, but I can't accept, and I don't think anyone else in the committee can accept, that it's a priority for the government. You said in your statement it's a priority for the government. It clearly isn't. We know what priorities for the government look like and how they operate. You look at something like Minister Ross's judicial appointments bill. Government decided that was a priority. And 3 years later in government, it's still meandering its way through the Oireachtas, eating up huge amounts of resources. So really, why there has been no substantive legislation introduced is because it isn't a priority for government. We regulate huge amounts of behaviour in this society, and it's astonishing that to date we haven't regulated gambling, which has such a negative impact on people's lives. We all agree there needs to be a regulatory authority, but can I ask you, when is the heads of bill going to be published? When is it going to be introduced into the Oireachtas? And what type of regulatory authority are you looking at? Is it going to be something like the Legal Services Regulatory Authority? Because unfortunately with gambling, we need a body and a group of people and an entity that's working on this every day of the week. Not sometimes Minister Flanagan looks at it, sometimes you look at it, sometimes this committee looks at it. We need a regulatory authority that's working on this every day of the week, coming up with its own rules, which will be made statutory instruments. And at present, that's not happening. So when and what form?
Thanks, Chairman. On the what form, that's an extremely good question. We have commissioned some research at the moment into to inform us as to what's the best way of structuring an authority. What kind of governance should it have? Should it have a board? Should it be a commission format? Should it be chief executive format? What various sections should it have internally? So we've commissioned some research on that at the moment, and we should have that at some stage by summer. Because again, as the Deputy said, we want an authority that will be fully active, fully engaged, independent of government, independent of the Minister of the day, and so that any kind of perception at all of any kind of pressures or lobbying won't arise. The next, as I said earlier on, the next role we have now is to publish the heads of the bill, and we'll be building on the 2013 bill and on the Fianna Fáil bill, and crucially on the Interdepartmental Working Group on Licensing and Regulation of Gambling, which we produced last March, and which took a lot of work and a lot of effort and a lot of time to put together. So I would hope that we would have that. Taoiseach has indicated the whole thing will take 18 months to bring forward.
From when?
From when the report was published in March. That's what he said. But again, it is a priority for government, and I've been personally pushing it as hard as I can to get it over the line. We're looking at best examples in all other member states as well and beyond to structure the authority as to how best to put it together. And we looked at UK, Malta, France, New Zealand, and so forth. Okay, I think that's questions answered. Yeah.
Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you, Deputy O'Callaghan. And finally, Senator Martin Conway.
Chairman, I am conscious of time, and I suppose some of the issues I was going to raise have already been raised. I think it is appropriate that we would commend Jack Chambers for the work he's done in this area. And indeed, I'm probably the only one here that was a member of the last Oireachtas Justice Committee, and at that stage, the then Chairman, now Minister Stanton, did a whole body of work in this whole area, and I know of his personal commitment. And sometimes, when you're dealing with government, there are pressing priorities, and I know he has been shouting extremely hard. And in terms of the Gaming and Lotteries Amendment Bill, it did pass second stage in the Senate last night, and it will move on to committee stage pretty quickly. And I think certainly that's an avenue that we can use here to maybe deal with some of the concerns. But I would welcome the Minister to come back here, and maybe we can discuss further his views in terms of a gambling regulatory authority. I would prefer it to be done over 18 months and done right, and use best international examples, and I suppose merge what is working well in other countries into one authority that can be among the best in the world, because gambling is an addiction, it is a problem, and it's becoming an even bigger problem and very difficult to regulate, given the fact that a lot of it now is online.
Thank you, Senator. There were no questions there for a response, Minister, but can I say, as the time is now concluded, it's 9:45, I want to first of all thank the members for the cooperation in restricting their contributions to the time issue. Minister, there's no question, but we would need to address this more substantively. It's unfortunate that we didn't have the opportunity this morning, but I would like to add one thing in response to an earlier point you had made. The constructive comments are welcome and all noted. I want to emphasise that all the contributions here this morning were constructive. Of course, yeah. And I think it is very, very important, the criticisms that have been levelled are intended to be constructive, and they have to be viewed and accepted in that mode. There is a real problem. The legislation that is before us is viewed by many as a barely stopgap. We need substantive legislation. I think that would be reflective of the views of the members, and we would hope also of yourself. Minister, we thank you for your attendance here this morning, and your colleagues, and we will suspend for 1 minute to allow for Professor Fulton to take her seat. discussion on regulation and control of the gambling sector, and I want to welcome Ms. Crystal Fulton, Associate Professor at the School of Information and Communication Studies at University College Dublin. I will shortly invite you to make your opening statement, but first I must draw your attention as a witness to the situation in relation to privilege. The same didn't apply in terms of the Minister because he's a member, so this applies in relation to non-members presenting before committees. Please note that you are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence you are to give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person or persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her or it identifiable. All that said, Professor Fulton, I would now like to invite you to make your opening statement. Thank you.
Good morning. Committee members, ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked to speak today about our research about the social impact of gambling. The issue of potential harm through gambling is a topic of international concern. The impact of harmful gambling may have wide-ranging social impact with risk of negative effects not only on the person who gambled but also on their families, friends and communities. A gambling problem can have extreme negative consequences for the gambler and for that person's social connections. Harmful gambling often has a significant financial impact on individuals and their families. This may lead to shame and stigma, which may contribute to social isolation. Understanding gambling behaviour and the social outcomes of this activity may contribute to the development of social policies in the area of gambling and addiction, with particular attention to policies which protect those vulnerable to the negative effects of gambling. In turn, the development of appropriate policies may help minimise the array of social, health and economic costs associated with the gambling problem. Participants in the study spoke of financial devastation as well as of social isolation. Both problem gamblers and their families also reported feelings of shame, stigma and social isolation resulting from a gambling problem. The purpose of our research was to examine the social impact of gambling in Ireland and to understand the issues from the perspective of those affected. In 2015, with funding from the Irish Research Council and support from the Department of Social Protection, we completed the first national study on impact, in which we spoke to the major stakeholders, including addiction service providers, recovering gamblers, the families and friends of gamblers, and the gambling industry. In December 2016, with funding from the Minister of Justice and Equality, we updated our literature review and invited stakeholders to comment on developing legislative issues around gambling in Ireland. Addiction service providers were located throughout Ireland and included any counselling service that worked with gamblers or their social connections who had experienced harm. Recovering gamblers and their social connections came from diverse backgrounds. They were located across Ireland, they were from different age groups, and they came from various socioeconomic backgrounds. Recovering gamblers also had suffered addiction to different forms of gambling, for example, one or more of casino games, fixed odds betting terminals, lottery tickets, scratch cards, betting on the horses or the dogs, etc. Some had pursued land-based games, while others had followed online gambling. Importantly, the first-hand accounts of individuals affected by gambling offer critical information about the social impact of harmful gambling. For those affected by gambling, this research provided an opportunity for those often unheard, vulnerable groups to have a voice, creating an important foundation of public experience to inform policy development. Our research explored perceptions of gambling in Ireland, the problems associated with problem gambling, and opportunities for treatment and prevention. Because of the stigma around problem gambling, it is often very difficult for gamblers and their social connections to discuss gambling issues openly. Stigma increases the hidden nature of a gambling problem and complicates recovery. This research made it possible for those affected by a gambling problem to take a step past this stigma to discuss the impact of gambling on them. And so the research has led to multiple findings. However, participants agreed on three major social measures. They identified open discussion and educational initiatives, approaches at national level to facilitate those affected by gambling, and legislative measures as key requirements for addressing the risk for harmful gambling in Ireland. Today, we would like to highlight some of these needs identified by participants. And so first, their desire for open discussion and education. Participants expressed a need for open discussion about gambling and the risk it can pose to individuals and their families. Today's public forum helps support that open conversation. Participants also spoke of a need for education. Some proposed education along the lines of life skills in the curriculum, from primary education through to university level education. While participants connected advertising with triggers for gambling, some suggested using advertising for positive impact to warn the public about the potential for harmful gambling. For instance, they suggested that advertising could be used successfully to help educate people and create awareness, similar to recent campaigns to increase public awareness and understanding of social issues such as mental health. And then their views on approaches to harmful gambling. Participants in our study have identified the need for multiple supports to treat and prevent problem gambling. There is an urgent need to bring together people and information to create a unified, transparent approach to facilitate those affected by problem gambling. A national strategy that encompasses government and charitable and volunteer bodies is needed to address causes and outcomes of problem gambling in Ireland. The framework for the General Scheme of the Gambling Control Bill 2013, intended to update legislation in Ireland, provided for the establishment of a social fund paid for by licence holders in the gambling industry for the purposes of promoting responsible gambling and assisting those affected by gambling. Under the draft framework, the Office for Gambling Control Ireland, in consultation with an advisory committee on responsible gambling consisting of a nominee, quote unquote, of the Minister for Social Protection, the voluntary/community sector, a representative from the HSE, and 2 representatives from licence holders. They would recommend distribution of the social fund for purposes such as education. This is in keeping with practice in the UK, where the Gambling Commission requires gambling companies with UK customers to contribute money to fund research and services around problem gambling. Our research outcomes included a recommendation that the social fund included in the general scheme should provide significantly for public education about gambling, and to do so neutrally without the influence of gambling operators. Participants also noted the existence of services in the form of counselling and treatment centres to assist gamblers in recovery. However, study participants noted a lack of services to help family and friends affected by a loved one's addiction. Participants called for action around harmful gambling to become a social priority and for the development of additional and expanded services to help those affected. And then to specific legislative needs. First, participants in our research identified the passage and, importantly, the implementation of new and updated legislation around gambling as essential government tasks to protect the public. Second, our interviewees suggested a variety of measures they wanted government to include around regulation. In particular, they wanted regulatory measures to provide a framework around gambling to protect those vulnerable to gambling addiction. Some of the specific measures frequently noted involved the regulation of, for example, advertising, increased taxation and licensing for gambling operators, maximum spends, measures to avoid underage gambling, numbers of particular gambling establishments, online gambling, opening hours for gambling premises, removal of fixed odds betting terminals, standards around the gambling industry's obligation to alert the public to the risks of gambling. A particular concern to participants was the risk of gambling to young people. Underage gambling was a common theme among recovering gamblers in our research. They frequently spoke of the early age at which they first saw gambling. The legal age to gamble in Ireland is 18. However, our participants reported collecting gambling winnings for relatives while they were underage and sometimes under the age of 10 years. They also reported an initial exposure to gambling as seeing adults gambling, both adult relatives and adults related to friends. From there, participants reported their initial gambling experiences as often occurring while they were young and often underaged. As their gambling continued, a number of recovering gamblers in our study reported that they progressed from land-based gambling opportunities to forms of digitized gambling, including digital gambling machines and online gambling. And this brings us to the relationship between technology and gambling. Participants in our research, including gamblers, family members, and addiction counselors, identified technologies that enabled digitized access to gambling as potential factors in harmful gambling. They referred to gambling via the internet, computers, mobile phones, slot machines, casino games and machines, virtual races on screens at betting shops, television, social media, and tablet computer applications or apps. They describe smartphone mobile devices such as iPhones as particularly convenient because these devices enabled gambling anywhere and at any time. In particular, technology now enables hidden gambling on phones, online, etc. Our work has revealed that the digital space, which is continuously changing, is a critical point to address regarding gambling, particularly with regard to young people. Young people are often considered more digitally literate and routine users of technologies. This familiarity with technology may make them more vulnerable to online gambling, especially if they play, for instance, excuse me, social casino games in which microtransactions are completed to unlock additional play features. Our second report found technology continues to feature in gambling, with online gambling and social media as popular means of doing this. The mobile phone is shown in research to be a particular access point for gambling, just as participants in our study spoke of attraction of mobile phones in gambling. The technological area of gambling is constantly changing. Recovering gamblers in our study spoke of technology as accelerating and deepening the effects of gambling because the technology enabled secret gambling. Our review found that responsible gambling measures can include self-exclusion and set limits on their gambling. However, research and our gambling participants have identified issues around self-exclusion measures. For example, the complexity of self-exclusion agreements, the inability of exclusion agreements to exclude from multiple venues simultaneously, gamblers using multiple accounts, the shame felt when inquiring about self-exclusion, an unwillingness or an inability to admit the existence of a gambling problem, and a lack of awareness about a self-exclusion program. In addition, our research revealed that social media are common forums for gaming opportunities. Because social media have developed rapidly and continuously, gambling operators can make sophisticated use of these technologies to interact with current and potential customers in new and evolving ways. Significantly, there is a blurring of lines between online gambling and social media games which simulate gambling. Importantly, social media may expose children to advertising and promotions on these platforms. While a range of age verification processes have been employed in different jurisdictions, there are technical and legal difficulties with online verification, which have led some to argue that parental responsibility and user education are critical. Since our work in 2016, additional technologies have arisen. For example, loot boxes or loot crates are a gaming feature in which the player can purchase random content through video games. New technologies pose a new challenge for regulatory bodies, not only for Ireland, but also for the EU as a whole. The gambling landscape offers significant challenges for legislators, but also challenges that participants in our research viewed as significant to address. Participants described harmful gambling as having a profound, life-changing impact on them, whether gamblers or their families and friends, and significantly they believed government could and should act to protect them and those at future risk of a gambling problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fulton. Appreciate the preparation, the work that you've put into your opening address this morning. It will be very helpful. The first to indicate is Deputy Jack Chambers. If others would like to flag up their interest, thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I'd like to thank Dr. Fulton for your work and the work you do in this area, and some of the reports you've done are very informative and obviously research-led, which gives us the impetus to try and drive change in this area. So I thank you for all the work you do. You mentioned your concerns about obviously the underage element to this, and how in your study participants are young children as young as 10 are collecting winnings and are heavily exposed to gambling. How do you see that as being rectified in terms of the updating of the legislation, the laws, in the context of, say, some of the kind of social casino games that mightn't involve a financial element but potentially trigger an addiction because of the the potential winnings, and then that can have an effect into the adulthood. So how do we address that, or what have they done elsewhere?
A lot has been done in different jurisdictions. Obviously, young people are very technologically savvy, and access to technology then makes it difficult to do things like check their age online. And then there's the issue of the games that they play online. There's a whole body of research around how young people interact with games online, and it is a very complex area, and it is a challenge for legislation, but one that, you know, needs obviously to be addressed.
Okay, and on legislation, do you agree with the Minister that he has had to delay this by 6 years because of the technological changes that have occurred? Or in your view, could legislation have been developed and enacted sooner than that period?
I can't really speak for the Minister.
No, but do you agree with his view?
In my perfect world, legislation would happen today. But I appreciate that it can take longer to do, to make certain changes. It would be great if we could get recommendations. We have the research. If we could get these recommendations implemented as gathered from participants' experiences and respecting the time that they have given to help us with this, so that we can reduce the number of people at risk from harm from gambling.
And I know in one of your pieces of research you mentioned the need for a national gambling strategy in the context of healthcare. And what's your view of the present healthcare provision for gambling addicts?
From the voices of my participants, when we spoke to gamblers and their social connections, they reported that they found it quite complex to get help. So, for instance, things like insurance, you know, which might cover them for alcohol addiction, but so they might have to present as having that addiction as opposed to gambling addiction, for instance. So there's that kind of thing going on in the background. In terms of funding for services, participants wanted to see more services. They asked specifically that services exist everywhere in the country. In particular, one of the things that came out was, you know, this business of family and friends feeling excluded, that they wanted more services that would help them because they're deeply affected by a loved one's gambling. And there are very few services in the country that administer to people whose families have been affected. So for families, there is the Rise Foundation, but it's located in Dublin, and not everybody can come to Dublin. And it doesn't matter whether you were really well off or not so well off, and then you suffered a gambling problem. It's a level playing field at the end of this because no one has any money. And so how do you come to Dublin for treatment? So they wanted services to be spread, importantly, to all the regions of the country, and they wanted more of them, and they wanted specific services to help families and anyone that had been affected by that person's gambling.
And on the issue of social media and the kind of blurring of the lines and the targeting of children and young adults to try and, I suppose, ensure a future population of gamblers from an industry, which is obviously the industry's intention. How do you feel we need to address that? Is it through the companies themselves, or is it through the overall legislative piece?
It's difficult to answer that question. Social media is, young people are attracted to it, we're all attracted to social media, and there's this sort of blurred division, as I said, between games and then this area that leads into gambling and grooming for gambling. And it's difficult, and I appreciate that. I do believe it has to be addressed in some way. It should be possible to look at online gambling and address everything that happens around it with any luck.
Or do you feel some online games are designed to blur the line to lead on to
some online games are designed to bring the person that would use the game, the user, into the game, because obviously they want them to play the game. It's just that some games attract young people as well into the area of, you know, winning a small win that maybe later leads to wanting monetary wins. So they might not immediately offer money, but they might lead to that.
And is there any industry crossover there that you're aware of?
I'm not really sure. I couldn't say specifically.
Okay. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, Deputy Chambers, thank you. Deputy Clare Daly, please.
Could I let Mick go ahead of me? It's just he has a question in the chamber, and I know he's only a short contributor.
That's okay. Deputy Wallace.
Thanks, Chairman, and thanks very much for your contribution. Just one point. I'm told there's about 45,000 people suffering from gambling addiction in Ireland, and Ireland ranks third in terms of gambling losses per capita, after Australia and Singapore. But significantly, we're actually first in terms of online gambling and losses per capita. And this legislation will probably expose customers to an additional risk associated with playing online. Online betting, while online betting is licensed, online betting and online gambling is still an unregulated activity. And the lack of regulation in Ireland means that there's absolutely no obligation to offer self-exclusion facilities, time-out facilities, or for new customers to set maximum spending limits when opening an online account. Do you think that when the government, do you think that there's a lot more that needs to be built into legislation to actually address the problems we're looking at?
Gambling needs to be addressed, period. So whether people are gambling in a land-based venue or online, there needs to be an addressing of all of it.
Right, okay, thank you.
All right. Deputy Wallace? You're okay. Deputy Daly, please.
And thanks very much for coming in. I suppose the difficulty that we have is that you've given us very good research to add to the debate for why we need legislation. The person who we could question about the legislation didn't have enough time with us, so I suppose you're in an unfair situation where we're really just asking you to confirm the evidence you've given us, and the one we needed to tease out with to implement some of that stuff isn't here to answer our questions. So if we don't have a huge amount of questions, it's just that you've given us a lot of the answers. But I just wanted to ask a couple of things flowing on. Obviously, the Minister, you would have heard him earlier, he kind of, to me, a little bit hid behind or used the excuse of the interdepartmental responsibility for this issue and the crossover between health and justice. And obviously the figures from the Institute of Public Health show the huge health and social cost of gambling, which far exceeds any income generated apart from the human cost as well. But I suppose in that context, what would you say the immediate steps that are needed to be taken? I mean, we obviously heard a little bit about the delay in the legislation, but improving, say, the addiction services doesn't need legislation. So in terms of priority steps that could be taken now that don't require legislation, such as, for example, developing maybe more points along the idea of a dedicated gambling addiction treatment service, but also your, I suppose, thoughts on the idea of advertising. I mean, should there not be a huge, high-profile, government-led campaign on advertising, and has there been much study done on the impact that might have? Because I think the lines have blurred. I mean, traditionally people thought of gambling as, you know, a fella going to the pub on a Sunday for waiting for the wife to make the dinner and then popping into the bookies, you know, and it was done like that. Now everybody gambles, like it's kind of completely through mobile phones and online. So in terms of advertising, the impact, other examples, is there much evidence out there or other things the government could do in the meantime if the legislation is so complex, which I'm not saying I buy that argument, but if it is, yeah. Sorry.
We specifically asked participants what they thought government should do, what they thought government should be responsible for, what legislative needs were, and how they would like to see policies developed. And so a lot of my comments today come from that. In addition, from all of this, one of the major recommendations of the report was that there should be a unified coming together plan, if you will, that there needs to be this unified national strategy to deal with problem gambling and the harm that it causes not only to individuals, but that much wider impact that it has on families and communities. And so that was something that we recommended. So that would mean that departments work together to facilitate some sort of addressing of this problem. With regard to advertising, advertising is a much debated topic internationally as well, and it provides a major means of promoting gambling opportunities. It was identified across our participant groups as a problem. They referred to multiple forms of gambling advertising as having a negative impact on them. For instance, if you are trying to recover from gambling and you're at whatever point in your recovery, maybe always in recovery, you might want to watch the sports on TV, but perhaps, perhaps that was something you always did, but the gambling was associated with it. So can you extract it? And the ads that are involved on television and online, the pop-up ads, all of those things were noted as things that made gamblers think about gambling, and it hindered, they were triggers in their recovery. So that was problematic. Even when they weren't looking at sites online that were gambling sites, those pop-ups could occur. So that's an area that needs to be considered. Advertising of the gambling, obviously on TV, in newspapers, especially where there's free bets advertised, that was considered problematic. And they saw, seeing the racing page, for instance, in the newspaper or advertising on TV, that could actually trigger gambling behavior. They had strong views on advertising in our study. They were very worried about young adults, young people. They deemed gambling advertisements potentially harmful to gamblers as well as to the recovering gamblers. So there's, the people who already have addiction and they're trying to recover, but there are also those people who are at risk. So they were worried about both.
And I think, it's very clear that advertising is used as the key hook, if you like, to get people in. And then once you're in, I think you're exposed, obviously, because it is an addiction and it's kind of put out there as a sort of harmless bit of fun. But once people are in that trap, then it's very hard for them to get out. So I'm wondering, in terms of, say, the impact of a public health campaign, like government-led, where on the one hand the restriction of advertisement, but on the other a public health campaign. Has there been any analysis done of the impact that might have about the dangers of gambling? Has that been done in other jurisdictions, a government-led initiative, a bit like the anti-smoking campaigns or whatever, curtail pro-advertising, but then public health, and has that been done to the study of that, and the impact of it?
And I couldn't speak directly to gambling, but I was going to say to you, yes, in other areas like tobacco, there have been different campaigns. And as I said in my original comments, people did propose, what about if we used advertising to promote a positive message and to help people and maybe to prevent them from getting into trouble in the first place?
Just briefly, and I know your focus is a lot on the health impact, but just in terms of, say, the government's efforts to control the online gambling issue and proposals there, I know a lot of it comes from the big companies, if you like, operating their servers offshore and making it more complicated for the government to control. But other countries do operate a kind of an IP blocking for non-licensed online operators, which means companies would have to get an Irish licence in order to be used by Irish customers. Obviously then, in that sense, the customer could be protected by whatever regulatory regime is contained in the Gambling Control Bill when we get it. I suppose, have you any thoughts on that, on IP blocking? It might be outside your remit, and if it is, I'm sorry, but is this an area you've done any detailed research in terms of how a regulation could actually be implemented in terms of online?
We didn't explore that. That was beyond the remit, but I appreciate your point, and I think it's accurate.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you, Deputy Daly. Deputy Jim O'Callaghan.
Thanks very much for coming.
To be followed, just to flag it up, Deputy Louise O'Reilly, I understand you've indicated, and Deputy Donnacha O'Leary. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for coming in, Dr. Fulton. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to read your research. I've read the paper you presented to us, but could I just ask you some questions about the research you conducted? Like, how many recovering gambling addicts did you have the opportunity to interview, or families of gambling addicts?
Okay, so our research design, we started out working with addiction service providers. We spoke to 10 people in 10 different organizations, and from there we conducted a snowball sample. So we sought, we put out a call for people who wanted to talk to us about gambling. They could have come to us if they wanted just to talk about gambling. Everyone who came to us as a gambler was in a stage of recovery. They were at different stages of recovery. It was a matched pair design, so they needed to nominate a family member, and because it's such an isolating activity, they don't always have that person. That family might be gone, so they could bring a friend. Okay. And so we interviewed both, and then we had so in the end we had 22 recovering gamblers, and matched with 22 people who were coming in, who interviewed alongside them as family and friends.
Okay, and were they from throughout the country, or were they mainly
Yes.
Dublin-based? Okay. I noticed in the paper you presented to the committee, you said that they came from, I think it was, various socio-economic backgrounds. I was surprised at that. I would have thought that gambling addiction would have affected more people from poorer backgrounds.
I think this is an interesting point. People were not necessarily economically disadvantaged who, apart from the gambling harm they'd had. They would have come from, middle-class families, working in professional jobs, that kind of thing as well. So, no, they were not all from underprivileged families at all.
And I suppose the people who you were interviewing, all of them had made the decision to seek support or seek counselling services already, isn't that correct?
Yes, either the gambler initiated it themselves or their family said, no, you're getting help.
Okay.
So what happens with gambling is that because it's so secretive, it can take a long time for a problem to surface. Mm-hmm. So usually there's a crisis. Okay. So a mortgage bill's been intercepted that hasn't been paid for several months. The bailiff comes to the door, wants the keys to the house or the car or whatever. So there's some sort of crisis point that comes that is financial and emotional. There's spouses of recovering gamblers in our studies talked about thinking that they had a marital problem because they didn't realize what their partner was doing. Their partner was leading this whole other double life. Yeah. So it comes to light in different ways, and it comes to light over time.
And from your assessment of the recovering addicts you interviewed, is their desire to get money to get out of a hole, is that the biggest motivating factor in their gambling, do you think?
Sometimes. When I spoke to addiction counsellors, I asked them about addiction and what it looked like and what happens. And they spoke of it being a mental health issue, of an issue where there's an emotional change that you're looking for. You're looking for that kind of good feeling hit by gambling. And it isn't even necessarily the loss at the end of it. It's the anticipation leading up to that actual moment when you find the outcome. Okay. So it's actually some gambling harm is actually something that we sometimes assume we understand it, but we don't always.
Yeah. So you don't think it's just the pursuit of money? It's actually a hit from being involved.
No, it's more complicated than that. It's in the end they might be chasing losses because they're chasing the losses because they don't want to tell anybody that they lost that money. The gambler will always talk to you about the wins they had. They don't want to share that other unseemly part. And the chasing losses comes when they keep losing money, so they keep trying to get it back. And that ends up being a vicious cycle.
And 22 gamblers and their families that you interviewed, did they all come to a shuddering halt when some significant financial event occurred, whereby they couldn't go any further?
There was discovery involved. Okay. So if a family member discovered that their child had been gambling, or often a wife discovering a husband's gambling. There were women in my study. There were not as many. I think that it's difficult for women to come forward. In Ireland, it's very difficult to say that you're female and you have a gambling problem. So there were 3 of the recovering gamblers were women. Again, different age groups and different socioeconomic backgrounds. Okay. And so they would come from different backgrounds that way, and they're different genders, and then there would always be this point, regardless of who it was, that this gambling was discovered. Okay. And so this puts a huge strain on the relationship that they have with their partner, their family, whoever. For children, they might witness their parents fighting a lot. We had examples of children, and I don't mean young children, I mean adult children talking to us. Telling us that their memory is of their parents fighting about money. Then there would be the spouses who, like I said, thought they had marital difficulties, and really what was going on is the husband or the partner would start an argument so they could go away and be left alone in isolation to gamble. So it's actually a lot more complex than we realize.
And what was the most common form of gambling that the people you interviewed were involved in? Was it horses or online poker? Or
They were involved in everything. So different people, of the 22, different people, for instance, some came to me, said, yes, the horses, that was definitely it. Some people, the lottery, some people, casinos. I did have a couple with fixed odds betting terminals. It just varied. There's a range. And it's more that a person, a particular form of gambling maybe speaks to a certain person as opposed to sort of laying them all out and everybody will try one, or it's not like that. It's just that person, for some reason, that particular gambling said something to them that they wanted to keep doing it.
And how large were the debts that they got themselves into at the end of the road?
I'm not really sure. I mean, and the other thing is that it's not. Yeah, I couldn't really sort of say here's the depth of the depths. But it doesn't matter if it's a certain number. Yeah. It's the number for that person. It's what that person financially can afford or not afford to lose. And that could be just as devastating, for that person.
And just finally, I suppose the reason we're here is to think about regulation of it. I presume you believe regulation is absolutely essential in order to deal with the problem that the people you interviewed faced. Yes.
The participants in this study said legislation had to be sorted, and they don't just want it organised and printed up and say, there, we have legislation. They want it implemented.
What specifically defined is, what do they want? Like, presumably they recognise there's a personal responsibility there, and no matter what we as an Oireachtas do, we're never going to ban gambling completely.
I know.
But what type of statutory measures do they want in place that they believe would be of benefit to their
I listed a number in my comments today. Yeah. Those are comments that came up a lot. So those would be sort of some of the main things that arose. Sometimes they weren't sure exactly how legislation could fix it, but they knew they wanted it to fix it. And so, regulation of all of these things. And they want to make sure that other people are safe. And so they're concerned. It didn't matter whether people were involved in land-based gambling, and some people did just land-based gambling. And so it didn't matter whether they were involved in that or whether they were online gamblers. They were all worried about young people and their exposure to gambling and their starting gambling potentially underage.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy O'Callaghan. Deputy Louise O'Reilly, and you're very welcome to the Justice and Equality Committee.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Dr. Fulton. Now, I haven't had a chance to read all of the survey, but I have engaged with this previously. And I'm interested in hearing your views, specifically in relation to the language that we use. So from what I have researched and what I have come across, what we're being told is that we should be talking about problem gambling, not necessarily gambling addiction. That if it is interfering with your capacity to be able to put food on the table, then, before the threshold for addiction might be quite high, but actually problem gambling is what we need to tackle. It's not just a full-blown addiction. And I'm just wondering, I have read conflicting views on this. Personally, you try to use the terminology problem gambling rather than addiction, because I think it tells you more about what's actually what actually is going on and what the impact is.
I think the terminology is tricky. So if you ask, when I spoke to addiction counsellors, they spoke of addiction, they spoke of problem gambling. A term that is coming more into the kind of the arena now is harmful gambling. So any gambling that causes harm is a problem.
Yeah. And I think and we need to be very careful with the language, because if you confine it to just addiction, that I think you set the bar quite high, and you're going to miss an awful lot of people. But I think that we need to be careful with the language we use. The recent survey, so the survey was done, the results of the drug prevalence survey from 2014 to 15 was published recently, and it conflicts with results from the north. So, for example, Dundalk, it's 0.8%, but 15 miles up the road in Uri, 2.3% is the rate in terms of problem gambling. So to me, it's ludicrous to suggest that, you know, you're separated by a couple of miles and there's that huge difference. And my feel is that the government have underestimated their figures quite substantially. I mean, I know it's something that doesn't happen necessarily out in the open, particularly online, but would you have a view as to why there would be such a disparity between those figures?
I can't actually speak to those figures. I didn't conduct the study, so I think you need to speak to those people who gathered that data.
Yeah,
that would probably be the most helpful. Yeah.
We have done, and it just strikes me that it doesn't make any sense to suggest that, you know, people who live so close together, I mean, you know, if you take just along the border counties, that it would be a problem across the border and not a problem on this side of the border. It just doesn't make any sense to me. But you spoke there about the need to prevent targeting of young people in particular, and I think that's something that we are going to have to incorporate into this legislation to try and make it robust. It's not going to be possible to catch every scenario, but I don't know if you're aware of the fast food outlet running a competition at the moment, a monopoly style competition. So you have to be over 16 to collect the prize, but you don't have to be over 16 to play, and it's a very it's a very attractive, I've seen the adverts on the TV, it's a very attractive form of gambling, particularly for young people, and there is a risk and reward element, because not every scratch gets you a prize. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the frame and the legislation, is it going to be possible? I mean, because there's an age restriction in that this company has to apply to the district court for a lottery licence already. There is an age restriction, but it's virtually unenforceable. So I'm wondering if you would have a view on how, in terms of preventing kids being targeted specifically, are there measures that can be put in place, and is there an example of international best practice that we could look to?
I think it's difficult for me to comment on that part of the legislation, in the sense that the legislators have to decide what will go into that. However, in terms of young people and the games that that are there are, as I said in my talk, there are blurred lines, and it makes it very difficult to sort of draw that one line down the middle. I think it's going to be difficult, but I think we have to attempt it. In terms of what is done internationally, the playing field changes every day. So, there are researchers looking at this whole issue of advertising in depth, and they're looking at games in depth, the whole culture of gaming and the impact that it has, the psychological impact. There's a lot more than just saying yes or no to a game. There's psychology involved. There's looking at the health perspective. There's looking at what is possible technologically. It's quite a complex venue.
Yeah, and just in terms of international best practice, is there anywhere that we could start? If we were to look outside of this wee island and look somewhere else and be able to say, well, look, they made a good start, or they have, they have got some of it right, because the technology is evolving absolutely, and possibly quicker than the legislation will be able to catch up. But I think that's, and you often hear that from people. They say, well, sure, you're never going to be able to regulate that. And it's nearly like, we shouldn't try. But I actually think for this issue in particular, and for young people in particular, we absolutely have to try to bring the highest form of regulation that we can. And I'm just wondering if there would be somewhere that even we could say, well, okay, start there.
I think I agree. I think it's important to try. I don't think it's appropriate to shelve it. Places like Australia are doing research around advertising, but there's a lot of work being done on different areas of it. So to bring it all together would be probably the first step in addressing that advertising issue.
Excellent. Thank you, Chair. Thank
Okay,
you.
Deputy O'Reilly, thank you very much. And finally, Deputy Donegal, please.
Thanks very much, Caoimhghín, and thanks very much, Ms. Fulton, for your presentation. I suppose, I think this is an area that's getting an increasing amount of focus. It is an area that has huge impact on so many people's lives, and I think it is a difficult addiction to tackle, because I think it is invidious, and I think very often hidden from view, even to loved ones, until, as you've I suppose, identified until a crisis point comes, whether, as you say, a bailiff or a bill unpaid and all the rest of it. But I suppose it becomes much easier now with the advent of, I suppose, huge amount of online opportunities to gamble. I suppose just a few specific questions first of all, and I suppose they're similar to the questions I asked the Minister. In relation to the separation of gambling and alcohol, if you have a view on that, like, I mean, I suppose instinctively I would be inclined to think that the two should be separated, they should be separately licensed and regulated, and obviously the presence of one makes the other potentially more dangerous or harmful, or on the other hand there would be those who would argue that, well, you know, the private members club, what's the harm in me having a drink with a game of cards and so on. So, like, I mean, I suppose my instinctive view is more towards the former, but I'd be curious just as to whether you have a view yourself in relation to that.
Among the participants in our research, there were people weren't necessarily only having a problem with gambling. They were also having a problem with alcohol or with drugs. So there is this kind of co-addiction or so that it often happened that people talked about they talked about having that kind of, you know, problem with one thing or another, or going for treatment about one issue and then discovering that they also had a gambling issue. So it didn't come out until they were in therapy and in trying to get well. So it's hard to separate in that sense. But I appreciate your comments about the differences between the two. If somebody is having a problem with alcohol or drugs, there's an immediate physical response that you can identify, if you will, to see that somebody is, you know, intoxicated in some way. So with gambling, you're not putting a substance into your body to try and change your mood. You're using gambling to do that, and it's, you know, the outcome is different. So, you know, any of us sitting here could be gambling right now, but we wouldn't necessarily know. But if we were drinking to excess or taking drugs, we would know potentially. There would be observable physical signs. So that would be a big difference there. And the other, as I mentioned as well, the issue of getting help isn't always flagged as getting help for gambling. So comments earlier about how do we see how many people are, you know, coming and asking for help, it's actually quite difficult to count, because if they're presenting for alcohol problems so that they can get insurance to cover the treatment, when really they have a gambling issue, this again becomes quite a complex space. So there are a whole lot of things going on in there, is what I'm saying, and it's. I see your point to be, you know, can we divide them? But I also can see how there's overlap.
I suppose my question is more so not so much trying to compare the two forms of addiction, which I suppose have commonalities and differences, but whether licensed premises should be prohibited from having the opportunity to gamble in them, or whether gambling premises should be prohibited from serving alcohol. I suppose that's more my question from a legislative response.
The legislators will have to decide. Yeah, I mean, I didn't ask people if they wanted that, so
okay.
I couldn't comment on what they said on that because they didn't say.
Okay. I suppose the issue of age verification is obviously a very tricky area. Yeah. It's obviously desirable but difficult in practice. Like, I mean, I think it's vitally important, but like, I mean, have you a view on the existing policies of, I suppose, particularly the big online bookmakers? Have you a view into how that might be best achieved, or how the age verification process can be improved?
I think there are different ways to go about this, and I wouldn't consider myself an expert in, you know, how to put that together. I do know that it involves, you know, again, another complex area. It involves looking at the technology, but also how to get around it. I would say that there were people in my study who commented that, you know, it's not difficult to get around this, or, you know, certain things that are put in place. So it has to be, you know, it's a space to watch, because it is possible to circumvent some systems, and I know that.
Okay. I have two more questions. I suppose first is, I suppose, a related area, and I suppose just the area of restricting access, particularly online. And I suppose I touched on this in my previous contribution. Like, there are, I suppose, policies, but like, I mean, I think they can be weak. Obviously, there's ways around them. They can, like, I mean, should there be a uniform sort of exclusion for people that can carry right across several companies? I'm not sure technologically how you necessarily you'd manage that, but like, I mean, if somebody has been identified to have, I suppose, patterns that are difficult, should there be some way that they can either exclude themselves or be excluded from right across the board from the various companies? Is that something that can be explored? Like, I mean, from your experience of the major bookmakers, just say, like, I would have personally doubts as to whether they are using all the information available to them. Like, I mean, I suppose you contrast the ability of some people to lose vast sums online or I suppose in person as well. And then on the other hand, like, I mean, there are many examples that can be found online of, I suppose, people who have placed 4 or 5 bets, made a small sum of money, made profit, maybe beat the odds. And I don't mean to cast any of these people as folk heroes or, you know, virtuous or anything like that, but like, there does seem to be, to me, a contrast between the ability and the lengths that some of the bookmakers will go to try and ensure that their profits are preserved and to try and reduce the ability of people to make money. And then on the other hand, the fact that people seem to be able to spend vast sums of money, lose vast sums of money, display very problematic patterns and behaviours, and yet they're not restricted. So, like, do you believe that the gambling companies are using all the information at their disposal to try and ensure that people aren't entering into problematic behaviours?
Oh, I couldn't speak to that. I mean, it's, yeah, because I wouldn't know exactly what information's at their disposal, and I wouldn't be able to comment on what they're using. What I would say to you is that participants talked about self-exclusion, and they talked about the problems with it. So, you know, they might self-exclude at one place, and then, you know, go and have a sneaky bet somewhere else. You know, so go somewhere else, and so the exclusion, yeah, okay, I'm excluded there, but I'm not excluded there. So there was this kind of blanket exclusion. So it becomes this tricky space of, as you say, how do you do this across venues for an individual who's having a real serious problem? How do they achieve that? It's a difficult one, and again, it's one that needs in-depth exploration in terms of how to handle that.
Okay, right. Just a final question. Again, look, I mean, you may have said that this is, I suppose, for us, like, but, like, I mean, I suppose it's very visible in Britain at the minute, like, in terms of the Premiership and even right down the lower tiers, the prevalence of gambling advertisement in sport. Is that an area that you believe needs legislative restriction? Like, I mean, I welcome the GAA has announced, I suppose voluntarily, I suppose, a ban on gambling companies sponsoring teams, but, like, I mean, do you believe that there is a need for restrictions of that kind, that restriction on advertisement of, particularly with sports teams, for gambling firms?
I think, this is a complex area, and it's important that there are people from grassroots position taking measures and taking a stand, as well as legislation. In terms of advertising, it's something that, you know, it needs to protect the vulnerable. It needs to protect children, especially. So there is a lot there that legislation can do to protect children in the same way they would protect children in other venues. So it is possible to do.
Okay, and just a final question, just as of course, like, I mean, is there a noticeable increase in I suppose adolescents, so far as you're aware, reporting problem gambling or having gambling problems, and if so, like, I mean, what kind of changes there been noticeable? If not, that's okay.
I haven't heard specifically of more children from any given source. Among my participants, you know, I did have people across age groups, so I did have some younger people. They were 18 or older, obviously, and they could speak to their gambling before they were 18, but they were at a very tender age, 18 to 21 kind of thing, in recovery. And yeah, so they would say that yes, there needs to be, you know, more regulation around what you're talking about. But across the board, like the problem with gambling is that it doesn't always work the way we think it works. It's it can take a long time to develop a problem. Online gambling can accelerate that development. So because it just draws you in that much more quickly. You can play immediately. You can play for a lot longer. There's no closing of the doors and saying go home. So it's the process of addiction can vary.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, Deputy. Thank you. Well, thank you, Professor Fulton.
Thank you.
And I don't think there's any further points or contributions to be made. So on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you very especially for your engagement here with members throughout the past period and for your submission that will be fully taken into account in our deliberations on this matter. This is obviously an issue that isn't concluding here today by any means. So we thank you for that, and we may meet up again in the future. So once again, Goramila Mahagat, and we shall now go into private session. We'll take one moment to allow Professor Fulton to withdraw, and then we'll go into private session to deal with the housekeeping matters, the normal weekly address of our private business. Thank you, Professor Fulton.
Thank you.